everyone, I hope you're doing brilliantly. Today I'm going to be talking about the Prelude by William Wordsworth. I've tried to do a good amount of research for this one since it's really quite a long poem. Of course, the GCSE piece is just an extract, but it is still pretty long, and for that reason, it really does help to have some background information about it, I think, even without you having to know the context for the exam. I think it helps you understand it. So let's have a little look. So it's important to note that William Wordsworth is a romantic poet. He has a lot of typically romantic characteristics in this poem, such as the fact that there's a lot of nature, but there's also some pretty intense feeling and emotion that comes with it. So in this case, it's the adoration at the beginning for nature and the fear towards the end. That means that in the middle, there's a volta, which means the tone, which is just like the emotion or mood of the poem, does change pretty suddenly. I do have an entire video on romanticism and the romantic poets if you want to check it out. But yeah, so he has this spontaneous overflow of emotion, according to a contemporary critic, which is a pretty adequate way to describe him and his writing, I think. He lived in the Lake District with his grandparents after his parents died, who he didn't really get on with very well. He really didn't like them to the point where it began to give him some mental health issues, and it really wasn't good for him, bless him. So he kind of used nature as a bit of an escape from that. Obviously, living in the Lake District, it was quite easy to access all of that wonderful nature. So that's why he writes such an amazing poem about it. But in this specific case, it kind of ends up scaring him because he's not really meant to be out there, and that's how much of an escape it is. And for context, this is what it looks like in both the day and the night. So pretty different. And obviously, these are very idealized pictures. The second one is probably heavily edited, but the point still stands. It's full of mountains and craggy ridges, as we see in the poem. And that kind of thing gives way to another part of Romanticism, which was very much a thing in the Victorian era. And that thing is called the sublime. And Edmund Burke, who kind of came up with the idea, he said this pretty much about the most intense feeling you can feel. It can be associated with awe, pain, terror, or anything that's just really an intense emotion. So here we've got terror in the Prelude. And the reason I've put up this painting is because J.M.W. Turner, who's the painter of it, was very interested in this notion of the sublime, and you can see it in his paintings. So this is a storm, if you can't tell, it's quite abstract. But the idea of nature and things like storms being so much bigger than you and making you feel a bit insignificant, it really inspired something in him. And I think J.M.W. Turner was very similar to William Wordsworth in this sense. So if you want to know how to link back to this in your exam, definitely look at the video on romanticism that I have on my channel, because it's really good for that. But in the case of other contexts, the Industrial Revolution probably acted as a bit of a catalyst for all this finding nature as an escape, because, of course, if everything around you is very man made and industrialised, you're probably going to want to escape it a little bit. And being in the cities was probably pretty hard because of all the smog and factories, like you can see in that image there. I'm also sure if you've studied this, you know by now that this is part of an epic poem, which is a much, much larger poem. So the whole thing, I think, is over 200 pages, which obviously is insane. Epic poems generally have one hero to them, one very defined hero who is inherently good. If you think of things like the Odyssey, where you've got Odysseus traveling around saving people, and obviously he's not traveling around saving people in the Prelude, but he is very much the defined protagonist. And it's semi-autobiographical, or it is autobiographical, I suppose. Anyway, I very recently read the whole thing cover to cover, and some parts are more interesting than others, I'll admit, but within it, he talks quite a lot about the French Revolution. He was conflicted about the French Revolution, and at first he really believed in it because it was really for the good of the people, so the proletariat, which basically just means the working class. and it was going to help them. That was the intention, but it soon did become more corrupt than it was supposed to be. So it is understandable that he questioned it in the end. But the reason I'm bringing this up is because you can definitely see his conflicted nature from the beginning, even in this poem. So he was interested in philosophy, which means he'd probably read the philosophy of Edmund Burke, who was the person who came up with the Sublime. And he was also poet laureate. So just like Duffy, who was the poet laureate when I was at GCSE, and Tennyson, who was the poet laureate in the 1800s, and Hughes, who was the poet laureate in the 20th century. These are all on the power and conflict cluster. And Simon Armitage as well, who is the current poet laureate, who wrote Remains. Um, he had this kind of, because of this, he had this kind of national responsibility to produce poems that made the country either look good or that addressed English events. So, for example, how Tennyson wrote The Charge of the Light Brigade, similar sort of thing. He had that responsibility as well. So there are a couple of pieces of reception here, which is just really how the poem's been received, so what people think of it. You don't need to include these in your essays until A level. So if you're thinking about doing literature at A level, definitely start thinking about maybe reading around different pieces of criticism to get a feel for it. But these are really just here to help you understand the poem and get an idea of what other interpretations might be. So, for example, I think intense reality is an amazing way to describe his poetry, especially that word intense, because if there was one word I would use to describe this poem, it would be intense because of the end. And we've also got A.C. Bradley over here saying that Wordsworth is sublime, and obviously now we use sublime as kind of synonymous for good, but here he means the nature is overwhelming, which of course is exactly what we've been talking about. And like how I said about the prelude being more interesting in some parts than others, Saws and Sinks is an amazing way to describe that. But to give him credit, it's kind of hard to keep up blank verse for 200 pages. It's really, really hard. Blank verse is that iambic pentameter with no rhyme, how you often see in Shakespeare. Of course, this is all one single stanza because it's part of a larger epic poem, but in the epic poem, there are actually breaks where he feels there should be. So, why is this bit specifically all in one chunk? Well, it might be maybe to depict the flow of the water across the water. I almost feel like that stream of words is like the boat streaming through the water. And there is also, as is typical of blank verse, no rhyme, which maybe is to do with how the nature is pretty unpredictable. I mean, I keep going back to the sublime because that really is what the sublime is in this sense. But we should have a little look at the actual poem itself. So just keep it in mind about its context, the epic poem, and its structure as well. So, first of all, we have that led by her comment, which is immediately interesting. It's the first indication that he is seeing nature as a person, so he's personified it. He's used personification, but not only is it personified, it's feminized. It's a female pronoun. Is it maybe because he sees a delicacy in it? And later on, too, not in this part, but we have the word lustily coming out, which suggests there might be something weirdly sexual going on in his mind, especially if he's an adolescent or a teenager at this time. We don't really know. Interestingly, though, it's not in the first draft, is something I noticed when I read it. He edited it to say that. It's worth thinking about. It was intentional. Again, we have that female pronoun in Unloosed Her Chain. So the boat is female too. And why is the boat female? Is it the same delicacy or is it something else? And that very idea of chains suggests entrapment and imprisonment. So maybe when he's with her, in quotation marks, he feels free. He does set it up like he's escaping from chains and imprisonment with the stealthiness. And then we have that beautiful imagery finally that he's been withholding so far. So small circles glittering in the moon and sparkling light just underneath that. It's gorgeous imagery, it's very natural, and it's easy to see in your mind the rippling of the water. So when he's rowing, he's facing backwards because, that's how rowing works. but he's being very fixed in his ways, unlike the nature. The nature has melted, but the narrator is, you've got quotes like, or words like fixed and unswerving. It already foreshadows how they're not compatible with one another. So we start to get hints with quotes like craggy ridge, that nature isn't always so beautiful. And Craggy has this sense of unevenness, unsymmetricalness, and almost a sharpness. But then he doesn't really notice it at this point. We're back to the stars in the sky. He hasn't really cottoned on yet. So here is our next bit. Here is our lustily. But before we have that, we have the phrase elfin pinnace. And what the hell does that even mean? Well, a pinnace is a type of boat, but elfin, it is very associated with fantasy, so like elves or other small creatures. And we don't really know why he might have done it like this, but I like to think that he's so in awe at what he's seeing and finding that he is finding magic in all of it. So the fantastical elements are coming up. This is especially significant, remember, because he's a child in this extract. So this is why he gets so scared. For him, the line between fantasy and reality is very blurred because you're so much more likely to believe in magic as a child. And he pictures the mountain at the end as a monster too. So nature is magical in both positive and negative ways. We also have that little simile, which is easy to gloss over actually, like a swan. Most people don't pick this out, but swans are symbolic of beauty and love, beauty of nature, love for nature, which are both things very much present in this poem. And of course, swans are completely white as well, so they completely represent purity, which is interesting because he's also pretty pure at this stage, given that he's a child, even though that is arguable because he's having sexual thoughts kind of about nature, and he's sneaking out when he's not meant to. But this swan serves as a juxtaposition to the next few lines. The swan is white and dainty, but now in the next lines we have a huge peak, black and huge, which is literally the opposite. It's antithesis, if you want to sound fancy, but you've probably heard before, the huge peak, black and huge, signifies the breaking down of flowery language. It's the breaking down of his flowery adoration of nature. He's frightened, so he doesn't really care about making it all sound pretty anymore. He sees the mountain as something so much bigger than him, which is obviously part of the sublime, which has more power too, and it is almost predatory. It is personified with this idea of having power and the idea that it actively uprears its head. It almost gives it a kind of identity. So now we have words like struck, which are much more violent as opposed to dipping of the oars in the second line. So there's much more desperation there. And yeah, that repetition highlights all that desperation to get away from what he thinks is grim. And that word, grim, is very negative and a very good indicator of how he sees it. So notice how he says as well, he says shape. He doesn't say mountain or anything like that. It's deliberately vague. He doesn't know what it is. And like a living thing strode after me, it gives you the feel of some, you know how some portraits' eyes follow you around the room? So it's kind of like that. And in contrast to before, when there was nothing between him and the sky, we now have the mountain between him and the sky. Something I see a lot of people gloss over as well is that phrase measured motion. If something is measured, it's usually pretty meticulous. And it is alliteration, yes, but if you're going to analyse this quote, I would pick out the word specifically measured, because it almost seems like careful planning or scheming, almost to catch prey or something. It's very clever. It's like calculating. Bless him, at this point he doesn't even know what to think. He's been really affected by this, all because he's had an overwhelm of the sublime. We've got grave and serious, dim and undetermined. These are all negative quotes. But unknown modes of being, that is a phrase that very much describes the notion of the sublime. The metaphor, there hung a darkness, there is possibly more to it here than we are led to believe at first, because nature was his escape, but now he's scared of it, so he doesn't really have it anymore, or at least not like he used to. So that escape that brought him so much happiness now brings darkness, and he literally can't escape the darkness. It's emphasised by the anaphora in there, so no familiar shapes, no pleasant images, no colours, and that repetition of no emphasises how he's been stripped of everything that made him happy. And then lastly, we've got that quote at the end, which really hits home how bad the memory is. It affects him both night and day. It troubles his dreams. He's having nightmares about it. And because of this, if themes like memories pop up in the exam, it's really good to know this poem because, of course, it's memories and it fits really well with things like poppies and the emigre and kamikaze, even. You got this, guys. Thank you for watching, and if you like this video, then obviously give it a like, and I will see you next time.